Okay, so why don't we get going? Hello, everybody. It's very nice to have you all here today. Before we jump into everything, I just want to introduce myself and also introduce Fairygodboss a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with who we are and what our mission is. So I'm Dan Sprock. I am the Director of People and Culture here at Fairygodboss. I have been with the company for about a year now, and I have roughly 8 years or so in the HR and people and culture landscape. So any questions that you might have regarding recruiting, resume tips, making your profile stick out, which we're going to get to in a little bit, I'm very, very happy to field questions about that. I'll get to that in just a second. And for those of you who might not know, and I'm sure some of you already do, but here at Fairygodboss, we are the largest career community for women. Our mission is to improve the workplace for women by increasing transparency. We offer a variety of free resources like anonymous company reviews, job listings, articles, virtual recruiting events. Those are really big, and a lot more to ultimately aid in our mission of helping women succeed in their careers. So yeah, that's the basic rundown of who I am and what I do here at Fairygodboss. I do want to tell everybody that there will be a Q&A before we actually dive into everything. We'll be taking questions at the end of this webinar, which is going to end right at about 12:45 or so. You can ask them either as yourself or anonymously. It's totally up to you. And you can just use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen there, okay? So, and this webinar is also going to be recorded. So it'll be sent out after this as a follow-up. So you can feel free to rewatch anything that you may have missed. So yeah. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to give you a view of what my Fairygodboss profile looks like, so we can show you how to do this. Okay, so basically here, we are logged into my Fairygodboss profile, okay? Once you access yourself as a user, you'll be able to create a professional profile, basically one of two ways. So on our home screen, you'll basically see something like this. You can actually take the link to professional profile here to create yours, or you can click the jobs tab up here. Give it a second to load. And you can also create your professional profile here. Either way, you're going to land yourself in the same place. So the way that we ultimately get started with creating a professional profile is we want to upload our resume, right? Everything starts with the resume. So today we're going to be doing a sample resume. It's not actually going to be mine, but we're going to use a sample resume from Miss Barbara Smith, who we have told, who we've labeled as a business manager, okay? So what we'll do here is let's upload a new resume. So let's say you have your resume saved somewhere on your desktop or in a folder in your desktop. You'll simply select it, click open, and it's automatically going to upload into our website. Now, you might have to adjust a few things. Most of the things that come from the resume are going to automatically translate to the relevant boxes, but you might have to just make a couple of adjustments. So here, if you get anything in red that says required fields are missing, you can just go in, see, for example, here, it just happens to be missing my location real quick, New York, New York. Done. It's probably going to be the same thing here. New York, New York, done. And New York, New York, done. So all of my relevant experience has now been uploaded. Now, bear in mind, this is not yet active for people to see, okay? You're going to have all the time that you need to actually go in, make the relevant edits before you actually publish your profile onto our site, okay? Again, just quickly go through anything. I do apologize for a few of the boxes that are not auto-generated. Most of it is, luckily. Boom. So you can see that I basically just confirmed Barbara's experience, her 3 most recent roles. Her education has now been completely confirmed. And now we're down in the skills section. And I want to stop here and talk a little bit about why this is so important. So When you start to create your job profile on Fairygodboss, you are going to be able to assign certain skills to your profile. I highly recommend only attributing skills to yourself that are relevant, because you're gonna want to hone in on the amount of opportunities that are specific to you, okay? Not so much about generating the most opportunities, it's about generating opportunities most relevant for yourself. So you'll see here that we have some that are already auto-generated, sales, general, etc. But maybe there's something here that you don't see that you really want to add. Like, for example, I don't see anything here about design. So if I start to type in design, boom, I get a bunch of different options. Design, more specific things like product design, graphic design, etc. So if I want to add that, I absolutely can. Remember, spend time on your skills. It's ultimately the thing that's going to get the algorithm for all of your relevant occupations, all of your relevant roles to really be specific to you. When employers like to search different candidates, oftentimes their ATS softwares, oftentimes their way of recruiting, they have sort of their own formulas, their own algorithms that are really kind of honed in on specific words, specific skills. So make sure whatever skills you're attributing to yourself, one, are very, very relevant to you, and two, they're as expansive as possible, so long as being relevant to you, okay? What sets you apart? Now, down here, I think a lot of people sometimes confuse this section for like an objective, right? Sometimes on people's resumes, we have a summary objective, which the summary objective is usually something along the lines of, experienced graphic designer wants to find a role in XYZ, right? That tells an employer what you want. But what you really want to put here is what you're gonna actually set yourself out as that makes you attractive to an employer. Okay, so this is less about what you're looking for and more about why you are attractive to a prospective employer in just 200 characters or less. So this is like your elevator pitch, right? This is like your 30-second intro and condension of yourself that ultimately captures who you are. So you'll see here that we do offer like an example here. I have over a decade of experience in tech sales and I've won numerous awards. The second you click on it, you'll be able to just make up your own. I'm going to copy and paste something that I wrote up. Sorry, 1 second. I'll just write it real quick. Let's just say an experienced HR leader with recruiting, diversity and inclusion, and engagement. Recognition. See here, I've only used up half of my pitch here, okay? The next half right here, you might want to say something that you're specifically proud of, like recipient of HR award in 2019 for outstanding recruiting, or something to that extent, right? So you see here, I've now pretty much summed up myself in a very, very short amount of time that makes me set apart, okay? Recipient of an HR award. I have a background in recruiting, diversity, inclusion, and recognition, but I'm not getting into specifics of those things yet, right? We'll get to that in just a little bit. So right here is your elevator pitch, really to set you apart. Remember, we are going to get to questions and answers a little bit later in the webinar. If you see any other fields that are required, again, you can simply auto-generate them. New York, New York. Are you willing to relocate? Let's say yes. Okay. Professional summary. So compared to what sets you apart, your professional summary is really going to be an extension of this elevator pitch, right? You'll notice here in what sets me apart, I mentioned some of the skills that I'm most proud of and I feel like I'm most well-versed in, such as recruiting, D&I, and engagement recognition. Here, I'm actually going to want to list the specifics of those things, right? So we won't actually write this out completely, but for recruiting, right? How do I recruit? Do I use a certain ATS software? Roles I've recruited for, etc. So right here, I'm just giving you an example of the things that you'll want to put in your professional summary rather than the part that actually sets you apart. So you're going to want to extend upon these 200 characters or less to down here into 1,000 characters or less, which really isn't a whole lot. One good direction if you're feeling a little bit lost in how you fill out both your professional summary and from what sets you apart, you might want to use your LinkedIn About You section. A condensed version of this can really be good for that, for what sets you apart, sort of as that elevator pitch. And then an extension of this might be really good for a professional summary as well. So, so using some of the aspects from your LinkedIn page, specifically the About You section, anything you want to mention that you featured, a little bit of a humble brag here. This is an article that I feature on my page. I was recognized by Business Insider as an inspiring HR leader. I'm very happy about that. And even the bullet points in some of your previous roles, right? You don't want to just list out the bullet points. That's really for a resume. But you can certainly take from this and condense into a few sentences here in your professional summary, right? So there's absolutely no shame in drawing some of that language over from your LinkedIn page. It is totally, totally fine. Everything else that was auto-generated, years of experience, bachelor's degree, what are your dream companies? You can go ahead and start typing in companies right here. First, I thought of dreams, so it made me think of Disney. It auto-generated, so you can put in the Walt Disney Company. So you can choose up to 5. So what this will really do is it'll give users on our site and employers also a sense of what kind of companies you ultimately want to work for, what type of cultures, size, industry. You'll notice that this is not a mandated answer. If you don't want to put any companies, you don't have to. But I would say if you know exactly what kind of culture you're looking for, what kind of size you're looking for, do your research and think about the companies that really stand out for you in those fields. And I would definitely put them here. But for now, we will leave it blank. The last 2, we are very big about increasing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, of course. So we do have the additional information regarding race and gender. You do see that they are mandated questions to answer, but if you prefer not to say on both race and gender, you can prefer not to say. You could also make it custom as well. So ultimately, that is basically the breakdown of how you set up your profile on Fairygodboss, okay? All begins with that resume, all begins with uploading it. You may have a few sections that you'll just have to confirm. If you see anything in red, don't worry about it. It just means that you need to confirm just a few things. Should pull most of everything else. And then finally, you can go ahead and save. If you would like to be eligible for virtual recruiting events, which I mentioned toward the beginning of this webinar, which I strongly recommend that you do so, you can also select that, yes, I would like to attend virtual recruiting events, but you have to save first. We are saved. Yes, I would like to attend virtual recruiting events. And then you would just need to fill out some basic information about yourself. And then ultimately, all you would have to do is save. So let's go ahead. Yes. Are you authorized? Yes. Do you require sponsorship? Let's say no. Save. Yes. Register me. Save and register. Success. So now you are registered for an event and you have finished your profile. Just say 1 to 3. Done. Great. So now on my profile, I actually have my job profile completely filled out. So now this is live on Fairygodboss. People can actually see my professional summary. Remember, this is all not relevant to me. I'm going to take this down right after this. This is Barbara's, not mine. But yeah, now it is active on the site and it is eligible for all of our users and our employers to see. So this is how we go ahead and actually create our profiles. So let me go real quick. Just go ahead and stop share for a second. I see that we have several Q&As. I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I want to go ahead and make sure that we've got some Q&As. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that we have and give you some answers. Is there a way to list coursework at a college if you haven't achieved a degree? Yeah, you can absolutely. First, I would very much recommend that, and this was asked by Anonymous, I would very much recommend that that is listed on your resume itself. I would probably put it under, if it's not something that's officially education, in that you have not achieved a diploma, that's fine. If you've achieved a certificate, or if you've taken X, Y, and Z courses, that can also be placed under education. It doesn't need to just be for a PhD, an MA, a bachelor's, whatever. So for something like coursework at a college, I would recommend that you still put that under education. Really, the only other place you would want to put that on a resume is under skills and interests. But since you're specifically asking about coursework, I would definitely put it under education. But make sure that that whatever it is that you are listing, it's still relevant to the role that you're looking for, right? So if you're looking for a role in marketing and there's coursework that you took in something like art history, it might not be terribly relevant. And recruiters really only want to spend time on relevant info. Okay, so that's really the biggest thing that I can recommend here, is that keeping things as relevant as possible, because recruiters look at a lot of resumes all day long. I can confirm that. Roughly how many, Anonymous asks, roughly how many skills should you include? You know, I think that this is specific to roles. I'm a big fan of having skills listed actually towards the top of the resume. I'm a big fan of the formatting being nice and tight, you know, maybe like 2 or 3 columns that captures specific platforms that you're familiar with, specific software that you know. Make the skills as specific as possible. So don't think of it so much as, you know, I need to have 5 skills, I need to have 20 skills. Make sure that the skills are specific. Don't say something like communication, right? That's a very general statement. It's not really a skill that is very, very defined for me. Communication can mean so many things. Whereas, you know, saying that if you're an engineer, for example, saying something that, you know, JavaScript, right? That's specific. That should be something that should be listed as a skill. But stuff like communication, organization, it's still things that I see a lot on resumes. And really, for the most part, unless you're very, very junior, the skill sets that you have should be really, really specific. So to answer your question about how many, it's a little bit less about quantity and a little bit more about quality and specificity. So I hope that helps. What sort of information, Anonymous asks, what sort of information would you suggest that we mention about ourselves? Anything that's going to make me remember you, right? So I'll use the whole communication thing that I used just a moment ago. Saying that I have great communication skills, I have great organizational skills. I promise you a recruiter is not going to remember that, right? Recruiters have to look at lots of different resumes. You know, the amount of time that you put into actually crafting your resume, sadly, it's just not the same amount of time that a recruiter is going to spend reading it usually, right? So you need to stand out kind of like as quickly as possible. If somebody is recruiting for a role pretty aggressively, they're going to be combing and scanning through resumes all day long. So I should know within the first 10 seconds of looking at a resume that you are a relevant applicant. So what sort of information would you suggest that we mention about ourselves? If you are somebody who has lots of different positions in the field that you are enrolling in, so let's say you're applying for a marketing position and you've had 5 roles in marketing, do not go into detail about the first 3 marketing jobs. You don't even need to put bullets for those. Put bullets for the 2 most recent ones, right? You're a senior person. You're very, very seasoned in your role, okay? So I don't need to see
every last thing that you ever did. I need to see the most important things that you are proud of, right? So when you think about the information that you should mention about ourselves, ask yourself, what are the things that I'm most proud of at my last company, at the company before that? What are the things that they remember me for, right? How do we remember Dan at his last company 2 companies ago? The answer to that question should really be the things that you highlight in your experience section, and sometimes in your summary statement as well. So I would start with asking yourself, what are the things that you think other people think about you? Because I think that that forces us to kind of like think outside of our own box, so to speak. So yeah, think to yourself, what are you most proud of, or what would people remember you for in your previous role? And those are the things that you should definitely mention about yourselves. Really, really great question so far. Anonymous asks, this is a good question. Is it better to highlight skills or a specific achievement in my elevator pitch / what sets me apart section, or should I try and include both? This is a great question. In my example that you saw, you'll see that I mentioned 3 skills, but I mentioned them like super, like, you know, plainly, right? I think I mentioned recruiting, diversity, inclusion, and engagement. That's it. I didn't go into specifics. I just said that I was experienced in them. The thing that I put in for the thing that I would put in for myself that sets me apart is I would probably do that humble brag that I just showed you all about on my LinkedIn page about being an inspiring HR leader as recognized by a publication, right? Because I think that an employer might stick out for them. It's not just your, it's not just sort of like passive information that's like HR leader with 7 years of experience. Like all that tells me is that I'm an HR leader with 7 years of experience. So it doesn't really do a whole lot. So yes, you can mention skills. For me, I kind of took it as a half and half approach. Mention skills, but don't get too specific about them. And then the next sentence, I kept it to 2 sentences. The next sentence, sort of one thing about me that really, really stands out. And, you know, that's for everybody, that's going to look a little bit different. It's certainly going to look different across different fields, different industries. But again, you can also go back to that advice that I gave with the last example, which is what makes me stick out, right? What does an ex-employee remember about me? What does a current colleague think about me when I ask them, you know, what would you remember me for in this role? I think that a lot of good ideas and a lot of good dialogue can come from that in your elevator pitch. So totally fine to mention skills, like you say, but yes, certainly don't dive into them. That's for your resume. And after that, it's in your interviews. Let's see here. Cherry P at Fairygodboss asks, how do you separate a skill versus a quality? That is such a good question. So Sherry, I think that the simplest way that I can answer that is that a skill is something that can be learned, right? If I happen to love woodworking. I love doing it in my free time. I mentioned that because that's a skill. I can teach you how to make a table, right? Like that's something that can be learned. Quality is not really something that is going to be learned. We're all adults. We all have developed our sense of personality. We've developed our sense of perspective, etc. So I think skill is something that is very tangible, is something that can always be improved upon because it's something that can be learned. And it's always something that can be gained too, right? If you don't have X, Y, and Z skill today, you could have X, Y, Z in skill in a month from now if you dedicate yourself to learning that thing. But a quality is more about who you are and what type of personality are you? Are you more of an introvert? Are you more of an extrovert? Are you more of a dominant personality or not? So I think skills and qualities kind of separate there. Oftentimes they complement each other, but I think that they are 2 distinctly different things that can oftentimes be confused in a skills and interest section on a resume, where people aren't just listing skills, they're kind of just listing personality traits about themselves. And personality is definitely important, but for the sake of a resume, right, when you're just kind of getting your foot in the door, when you're literally just trying to make yourself applicable for this role, it's more about skill and less about a actual individual quality. But that is an awesome question. We have a lot of questions here. Great. Okay, great. Anonymous asked, I like this question. How do I highlight things I've done that aren't tied to numbers like sales? For example, I started a company newsletter, but I don't know how I can show the impact it made on the company. Okay, so as a people and culture person, I love this because, you know, a newsletter like you're describing here, yes, I agree that this is sort of a more challenging thing to really get across on a resume. It's an easier thing to get across in an interview where you've got dialogue, you've got, you know, opportunity to like sort of flush out your thoughts a bit more organically and not so black and white, so to speak. But if this is something that you're really proud of and you really want to come across, you shouldn't shy away from it just because it's a little bit more difficult and a little bit more complex. Something like a newsletter, you say here that I don't know how I can show the impact it made on the company. Ask your colleagues, ask your former colleagues what they got out of it. Start with that. You know, it could be if a newsletter didn't exist before your implementation of one, perhaps you can tie it to something like employee engagement rows or as per an employee engagement survey, so to speak, using data, right? It shows that the newsletter was a welcome thing and increased morale, right? So there's lots of ways to do it, but with something like you're describing that isn't so black and white, that isn't so numerical, you have to think a little bit more outside the box on how to actually present that. So using something like an employee engagement survey, which I'm a huge fan of, you know, I would probably, you know, just survey my workforce and say, hey, this newsletter that I introduced 6 months ago, do you think that we've benefited from it and why? And using those results, because that is data, that does become kind of numerical, that does become kind of, you know, inarguable. Use it like that, right? As per the results of our company's employee engagement, as per employee data, it shows that morale improved, engagement improved, etc. It shows that you have the ability to actually have a very positive impact on the morale of your workforce, which is definitely something, especially in my field, HR, people, and culture, that employers will be very, very happy to see on a resume. So really good question. Anonymous asks, this is a good one because this is a pretty common one, which there's a lot of schools of thought on. How far back should my resume go? I've heard no more than 15 years, but not sure if that's standard. Anonymous, the truth is that there is no, you know, if you ask one person what the standard is and you ask another HR person the same question, there's a very good chance you'll get two different answers. My rule of thumb is that if you have an extensive career and you have a lot of roles, most recruiters do not want to spend time looking at a 3-page resume, a 4-page resume with really, really tiny font. And they just don't want to do that. They want to understand, boom, this person is this, they've got this experience, this makes them relevant, etc. So for someone in your case, or I'm assuming in your case, how far back it should go, I don't think that there's anything wrong with listing, 4, 5 roles or so. But I don't think that all of them should have bullet points provided for them, right? So I'll use myself as an example. If I were creating my resume right now, if I were kind of like reworking it, I would definitely have all of my experience from my current employer, Fairygodboss, listed. I would have my relevant experience from my previous employer listed as well. But since I had 3 roles in HR before those 2, I'd probably only put the company, the years worked, and I don't think I would dive into bullets because I do have other sections of my resume that I want to stick out as well. I have my skills and interests. I have my summary. I have my education section. So and because I don't want to make my resume too crowded, I don't want too much text on it. I don't want to go over 2 pages. And ideally, you really want to make a resume 1 page, at most 2. You can go back as far as 15 years, totally fine. But I think once you get past your previous 2 or 3 roles, you really don't need to be listing out all of those bullets for like every single thing that you did at the company. Again, recruiters only have so much time to spend combing through resumes that they're just looking for the most recent, most relevant, most applicable information possible. So yeah, you can go back, but I just wouldn't exhaust too much details the farther you go back. Anonymous asks, how should your profile be structured if you are returning to work after several years? It really depends on what if you've been out of the workforce for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it might be. I think the biggest advantage that you have as an applicant is conveying to employers how that time, right, how those 3 years, 4 years, how that time can actually attribute to a relevant and positive translation to the role that you're applying for, right? So whether you were taking care of a child or a family member, or you were traveling, whatever the reason might be that you had a gap on your resume and you're now re-entering the workforce, I think being very upfront, especially in your self-summary about yourself, about what are the things that you kind of learned about yourself, the new skills that you gained, a new perspective perhaps, that makes it relevant and transferable to the role that you're now applying for, can actually work to your advantage. I think it's a bit of an outdated expectation that recruiters just kind of like do away with resumes for somebody who hasn't been on the workforce for a while. I think that's something that was much more true years ago. I do think it unfortunately still happens at some employers that are not as progressive and not as open-minded. But I think that it's getting much better. And 2, it's something that I think that it can actually really make you stand out. Because most people who are applying don't have that gap. And as I mentioned before, it really is all about standing out at first. So I would use it to your advantage. I would say that, in my last 3 years of being out of the job market, I developed some skill sets that I never thought that I would have gained, that I think are particularly valuable to this role, and they are X, Y, and Z, right? So I think that should help dictate how you structure your profile a little bit in your professional summary for explaining the fact that you're now returning to the workforce after several years. But it's a good question. It's definitely something that comes up. Anonymous asks, and this could potentially like piggyback off the last question a little bit in some sense. Ageism in work exists. Yes, it does. It absolutely does. Do you recommend putting dates on resumes when you are middle age looking for work? I think that it's really your call. I know that for a lot of people, they're not comfortable because at some companies that ageism does very much exist. But here's the thing. I recommend putting the years down, because I think that any company that excludes you because they could potentially have an ageist outlook is not a company that you want to work for. And I know that for a lot of us, we're in positions where we just need to get a position, right? But in all likelihood, that is not the morale that you're going to feel from an environment that approaches recruiting that way is not going to be the environment for you. So I absolutely, I've successfully recruited and hired for, I think I've seen back to like 1960 for some people, and I've seen as early as 1999, 2000 for others. So like, or rather like this year for new roles. But I think that you can certainly list them. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And I think that if an employer doesn't get back to you and you suspect it's for ageist reasons, you don't want to work for that company anyway, because that might just be the beginning or a little snippet of a philosophy that's probably not indicative of a healthy workplace and one that you probably ultimately don't want to be in. Okay, so this is kind of a long one, but I think it's really good. So I wanna read this. Anonymous asks, I've heard conflicting opinions on having a quote career summary, aka career highlights sections on resumes. What is your opinion? Also, what is your suggestion for someone who wishes to go into a management/leadership role, even though you haven't had a formal leadership title? Taking on projects that I feel show my leadership potential. Do you think a functional resume is okay for this rather than a chronological one? Okay, so we're going to take this part by part because I really like these questions, but let's kind of like take it one at a time. My opinion on a career summary is that summaries are fine, but I'm not a big fan of objective statements. Like I think I mentioned this earlier before. I don't like the idea of when you're summarizing yourself of showing what you're specifically looking for. I like the idea of summarizing myself that makes me attractive to an employer. Okay, so like let's look at the difference between those two. The difference is this: if I take it as an objective, I'm saying I am an HR leader with 7 years of experience, and I am looking to work in the hospitality industry. That's an objective statement. That's something that I want. That's what I'm looking for. But to make my resume stand out in my summary, I would instead word it as something like, kind of like in my elevator pitch before, experienced HR professional, skilled in recruiting, employee engagement, diversity, inclusion, etc. Because now I'm not saying what I specifically need. I'm showing why I'm an attractive candidate. And there's a very, very important difference between those two. Your resume is literally just getting your foot in the door. All that other stuff is going to come later on during the interview process to kind of like, narrow down what you want specifically in this role. But the resume is really just getting you recognized. It's really just the first step in the filtration process. So because it's that first step, and because recruiters see so many resumes, I would recommend that you can add a career summary. I absolutely think you can, but I would approach it with the mindset of what makes you an attractive candidate versus what you specifically are looking for, if that makes any sense. Second part of the question was, what is your suggestion for someone who wishes to go into a management leadership role, even though you haven't had a formal leadership title? I've taken on projects that I feel show my leadership potential. Do you think a functional resume is okay for this rather than a chronological one? I think a functional resume and a chronological one can be one and the same. And I understand your concern with the fact that you're looking for a leadership position, a managerial position, but you haven't really had that, sounds like, in your title before. Here's the thing. We all have to start somewhere though, right? We all have to get that first manager role. We have to first get that leadership role. So you are literally in the same position that every single other person has been in before they've gotten that first title, okay? So I think you're thinking exactly right. I think you link, even though you haven't had manager in your title officially, or you haven't had a leadership, title prior to this, use, like you mentioned, functional, tangible things that show that despite that, you have already managed, you have already taken on projects, you have already overseen teams of 2 to 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is. That's going to stand out, right? So do not be shy, and certainly do not lie about what your past titles have been. Don't call yourself a manager if you weren't one just because you want this manager role, but make those words really pop out either in your summary or your experience that shows that you have in fact managed and that you want to manage and that you were aspiring to not stop there, right? That part that I just mentioned is going to come out a little bit more in the interview rather than the resume. But I do agree with you that you do want to be functional with the resume, but it doesn't mean that it can't be chronological. If your managerial experience came, 4 years ago rather than, 4 months ago, it's okay. It's totally fine. So long as it shines through in the resume that I know that you want to manage and that you have done it before in some capacity, that's ultimately the most important thing. So I think it can be a bit of a combination of the two. Okay, so we have only about 5 minutes left, everybody. So I'm going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but let me get to a few more questions if I can. Good question. Okay. Anonymous asks, I'm trying to change job industries. How do I write an objective/elevator pitch that shows my skills, but also conveys the switch I'm trying to make? Parentheses, I'm going to go from being a teacher to working in law. I like this a lot. I actually used to be I was a teacher before I got into HR. So some commonalities there. So, you know, I think that recognizing, and this goes back to something that I was responding to with an earlier question, but I think you'll find that most skills in your prior roles to the industry that you want to move into, almost always you'll be able to find a way to link the two together, right? Because of the skill set you learned as a teacher, right? Some of those things, including, anything from like classroom management, curriculum design, how can you transfer that skill set to make it applicable for law, okay? Spending time on actually linking those and making a really, really good case for yourself, it shows recruiters that you are taking the time to really kind of like make inferences between a past career and to a future career. And if you're doing that convincingly, you've already done quite a lot to show me that you take this very seriously. You're somebody that's probably very adaptable, because if you can link those two together, it indicates that, you can be multifaceted. You can draw inferences in ways that, might be a bit more challenging, like on papers. So I think that every change of industry, so long as you can recognize the specific skill sets and then make an argument for why it's attributable to the next one, that's going to convey the switch and the validity of the switch better than anything else. Okay. So the more specific you are, the more tangible you are, ultimately, that's going to be the thing that convinces somebody that, yeah, this career transition, that's not so crazy. Maybe the specific experience that this person got from teaching is in fact relevant to law. So, so I would definitely recommend being very, very specific and tangible with your examples. Okay, everybody. So we are going to have to wrap up. Let me see if I can take one more very, very, very quick question. Anonymous asks, for a seasoned executive with many positions and years of experience, should the resume still be no more than 1 to 2 pages? I would say that, for somebody with extensive experience like yourself, that is probably looking for an executive role, that it doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be disqualified if you go to 3 pages or 4. But I would say that for someone like that, it's impressive if you can condense it to 2, because that shows me that you have this robust background. You probably have a million things that you've done at this point. And if you can really get across in just 2 pages why you're valuable and why you are applicable for this role, it makes it all the more impressive that you can actually take the time to really, really hone in on what makes your experience, this really, really long, robust experience, small and focused. It's something that recruiters love. So if you go to 3 pages, fine, it's okay. But general rule of thumb is that the better you are at condensing yourself and keeping it really, really focused, the more attractive you are to recruiters. And with that, it seems like we are out of time. So I want to thank everybody again for joining me today. This has been great. Please, this is going to be sent out. Like I said, this has been recorded. You can find me on Fairygodboss. Yeah, I'll see you all at the next one. Bye.